Sir Kannan Gopalakrishnan. He was working as a senior architect at Engineering Design Research Centre, L&T Construction, India's largest construction company. He's also worked on projects ranging from institutional buildings to international airports, apartment complexes to aircraft hangars. He's also attended 3 international conferences and 2 national conferences, and has also presented technical papers at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi, and the MSRIT, Bangalore. He's also won the national championship at Archaman at the India's largest architecture quiz. Sir Kannan Gopalakrishnan currently runs a design firm, Habitat Design Studio, and he is also a visiting faculty at the renowned architecture schools in Tamil Nadu.
Welcome to UGC lecture series. This is AR 6602, History of Architecture and Culture 6. We'll deal with Unit 1, Critiquing Modernism. This is lecture 1, and before we go into what we're going to learn in this lecture, we'll quickly look at why we study history. I find it very often that a lot of students come and ask me, why should I study history and why is it so important for an architect to understand and study history? I might as well be studying design and any other subject which actually helps me practice. Why should I study history? I always tell them history is very important for an architect, more important than any other fields, because history is the exact reverse of a design process. Because in a design process you have a context, you have a setting, you have all the requirements. Then what you do is you always try to come up with a concept or a design. But here in history you have the building, and along with that you have a very small written literature about the building, sometimes not even that, and from this you will have to get what the building tells us. From this you will have to tell a story. Now can you understand that history is the exact reverse process of design, but if you understand history you actually understand design. So with that we'll quickly move on to what we're going to study in this episode. We're going to be studying an art movement, or rather a group of people trying to start an art movement called the Team 10, and we'll be looking at another interesting concept called brutalism and its introduction. If we have to understand Team 10, we need to wind our clocks a little back towards Siam, which we studied last in the previous episode, previous semester. At the end of the 4th unit and the previous semester, AR 6502, History of Architecture and Culture 5, we saw that Siam was founded in 1928 by a group of 28 European architects, and it was organized by Le Corbusier. They called architecture as a social art, and it was a hugely influential movement at that particular point of time. They had all the principles of modern movement, and then if you could remember, there was this thing, Corbusier started to go less frequently towards Siam meetings, and there was all these really young people who started criticizing the movement itself, and they wanted to come out of the movement and start another movement. Then Athens Charter came into picture. Corbusier left Siam, which eventually gave birth to Team 10. So from this we'll have Team 10, often referred to as Team X sometimes, because X is the Roman numeral for 10. They were a group of architects who started assembling in July 1953 at the 9th Congress of Siam, and created a schism within Siam by challenging its doctrine approach towards urbanism. People of Siam were there, so they broke away from Siam, creating a schism there. They broke away from Siam, and then they started Team 10. The first formal meeting of Team 10 was done in 1960 under the name of Team 10. Although the number of people who were in Team 10 constantly kept varying, the core group consists of 7 of the most active and longest involved participants. They were Jaap Bakema, Georges Candelis, Giancarlo De Carlo, Aldo Van Eyck, Allison and Peter Smithson, Shadrach Woods. Here you can see the picture of the 9th Congress of Siam. Although Team 10 had these 7 important players who were most important, the most longest reigning people, they also had a lot of other people who came and went as time passed by. This is a list of all the other people who were the part of Team 10 at different points of time. Some of the people associated with Team 10. Team 10 called themselves as a small family group of architects who have sought each other out because each one of them has found the help of others necessary to the development and understanding of their own individual work. This has never happened earlier in architecture, when architects openly announced that, okay, I am not an individual, I need some other people also who are fundamentally necessary for my development and my understanding of my own work. This is what Team 10 people said to themselves. So, I need a group of people so that they will help me out. And in this case, people sought the help of each other. So, it was a mutually agreed group, and everybody sought the help of each other for their own development and understanding of their personal individual work. The theoretical framework which Team 10 announced came primarily only through teachings and publications. It has good amount of influence on the development of architecture throughout the later half of the 20th century, mainly in Europe. Team 10 was itself formed as a result of a schism from SIAM. There was another division which happened inside Team 10, which divided them into two major factions. One faction was the New Brutalism, which was spearheaded by the English Allison and Peter Smithson, and Structuralism, which was spearheaded by the Dutch Aldo van Eyck. Structuralism is a movement in architecture and urban planning. It was a reaction to functionalism of SIAM. They called that SIAM led to leading a lifeless expression of urban planning, and SIAM ignored the identity of inhabitants and ignored urban forms. So, just to create the identity of people who are living in that particular area, the structuralism objected SIAM's functionalist ideas, rationalist ideas. So, they started their own movement against that. While brutalism was a style of architecture which flourished between 1950s and 1970s, it spawned as a result of modernist architectural movement, which had linear fortress-like blocks, often with a predominance of reinforced concrete construction. The Team 10 people, they came together in the first place because of mutual realization of the inadequacies of the process of architectural thought which they had inherited from the modern movement as a whole. But more important, each sensed that the other had already found some way towards a new beginning. The entire Team 10 ideology was to be against modernist movement and against SIAM, because they thought that there were some processes which were inadequate in the modern movement, which was not completely correct in the modern movement. And even though they thought that they have certain solutions about this problem, they also realized that each and everybody else in the same group also had some or other ways towards a new beginning or towards solving the existing problems which modernism had created. So, this was why they came together in the first place. In this sense, Team 10 is utopian idea, but unlike the previous movements, Team 10 was not utopian about the future. They were utopian about the present. Thus, their aim is not to theorize, but their aim was to build, because they believe that only through building can utopia of the present be realized in real world. For them, to build has a very specific meaning, and that the architect's responsibility towards the person whom he builds for, towards the cohesion and convenience of the collective. Everybody here has to take the absolute responsibility here. The person who is building, the person who is promoting, and the person for whom the building is built. That was the idea of Team 10. They believe that no abstract master plan stands between him and what he has to do. Only the human facts and the logistics of the situation matter. They had the very strong connotations of modernism and they highly objected to the strong imposing rules which modernism had, which say that there is a master plan and you have to follow the master plan. And they kept on saying that the modernist movement did not allow for the human facet of looking at a project. This accepting a responsibility, they were talking about people's having responsibility. This accepting a responsibility requires another technique which they didn't have in that particular point of time, which is the working together technique, in which each member pays attention to the other person in as much capacity as he is able to do, because otherwise only one person will be in control of the whole thing and the other person will be simply following orders. While this accepting responsibility for mutual growth happens only when each people get attention from the other people. So that is what they projected. They believe that only in such a way that meaningful groupings of buildings can come into existence, because they believe that building is a live thing, it has life and it has to be a natural extension of the other life form. If two buildings are placed next to each other, they have a certain relationship. That relationship was very important for Team 10, whereas they claimed that modernism did not give importance to that relationship. Alison Smithson during Team 10 meeting says that as to people who are interested in Team 10 might ask a few serious questions. Why do you wish to know? What will you do with your knowledge? Will it help you regenerate the language of modern architecture so that it would again be worth inheriting? These are the questions which Alison Smithson would ask for people who will be interested in joining the Team 10. If they answer to these questions in the most expected manner, they probably would be selected or something, I don't know. But look at the quality of the questions. She asks that why do you wish to know and what will you do with the knowledge? And will the knowledge help a person regenerate the language of modern architecture so that it would be once again be worth inheriting? Says modern architecture as of now is not worth inheriting. You need a certain knowledge to regenerate the language of the present modern architecture so that it can become worth inheriting. But in essence, Team 10 was a very loosely organized band of individuals. The composition of the group varied considerably through the years. The first meeting happened in 1960s and the last meeting had only 4 people. There was no such thing as movement or membership inside the Team 10, because whenever they had the idea that okay, let's invite that person, let's invite this person, this kind of a talk invariably resulted in discussions which most likely leaded to heated arguments all the time. So because they were a little particular about whom they will be inviting for their meetings, and because Alison says, right, so they wanted people who would join Team 10 to be involved with them in that particular manner. So question of who to invite itself will create so much heated arguments. The Team 10's history is, it doesn't have a straight line, and to draw a straight line from where it started to where it end is highly impossible, because the history is a little scarred and it's very difficult to restructure or reconstruct the history, because this group's history challenges all conventional historiography, because specifics do not exist. Let's take a look at this picture here. This picture is the Play Brubeck ideogram, which is drawn by Peter Smithson, which shows a collection of points in time and space without any obvious hierarchy. They appear to be connected with a multitude of intersecting lines. This clearly represents the group itself, the unclear character of the group, the almost equally unclear character and the time frame of the group's activities, the question of the actual results of the group's meetings. They are all represented with this little sketch over here. If you critically look at Team 10, it could be argued that the only product of Team 10 as a group was its meetings, because as a group they didn't create anything. They all created individually as architects. They were working and they were creating buildings and structures and everything, yes, but as a group the only product which they did was their meetings, where in that meetings all the participants put up their projects on the walls and they had all the people sit in the center of the room. They were exposed themselves to ruthless analysis and complete fierce criticism by the rest of the people. This was the only product that Team 10 created, arguably. Allison and Peter Smithson were some of the most important people in Team 10. Their reaction to the post-war take on modernism in Britain was noteworthy. Their approach also came to be known as the brutalism in the future. They, instead of creating symbols of community within some rationalistic framework, they wanted architecture as an expression of the community itself. They said, break the rationalistic framework. We don't want a rationalistic framework to define what community must look like. We don't want strict framework created by logic or rationality. They wanted the community to express themselves. Architecture should be an expression of the community itself, according to them. They say that our hierarchy of associations is woven into a modified continuum representing the true complexity of human association. We are of the opinion that a hierarchy of human association should replace the functional hierarchy of the Athens Charter. Again, they say the same thing here. They say that hierarchy of human association is more important than hierarchy of function. When modernism says that if you're building a new city, the infrastructure of the city with its representative buildings should be in the city core, whereas Allison and Peter Smithson argue that for a city, the dwelling is a starting point for community. So that should be the core of the city itself. So they claim that this acknowledges that there is a gap between the formal representation of architecture and spontaneous human association. So according to them, these two must be together. They cannot be disassociated. Let us take a quick look at brutalism. This is one of the factions of Team 10. Brutalist architecture is a style of architecture that flourished from the 1950s to the mid 1970s. It spawned from the modernist architectural movement, and we already saw that the typical examples were linear fortress-like blocks which had predominance of concrete construction. So ideally what this style was about was, initially when they came about with the style, they said that this is the style for government buildings, low rent housing buildings and shopping centers, because after the World War II, a lot of countries were at terrible economy and they need to do a lot of reconstructing because most of the countries were dilapidated, had dilapidated cities. Most of the important cities had a lot of buildings that got destroyed due to the war. Eventually what they did was they had to look for kind of architecture that makes buildings become less expensive. So less expensive buildings can be done at a faster rate. So that is when exposed concrete brutalist idea came into picture. The word brutalism is not in its specific meaning. Actually it equates to huge buildings which are made of concrete, constructed between the World War II and the 1970s. But if this is the definition of the particular style, the number of projects that this particular style represents is staggering. And a lot of architects who were responsible for getting these kind of buildings done did not like the name brutalism. They did not want to sound brutal while doing a piece of architecture. They called it functional and ethical and sometimes even honest. But brutal is not in the exact physical meaning of the actual word itself. So they did not like the name of the style which they were following. One of the best known early works of brutalist architecture is done by the French architect Le Corbusier in his United Habitation and the Secretariat building for Chandigarh. These are the buildings here. It falls clearly within the category of large buildings made of exposed concrete, built quickly, at the same time gives like a fortress kind of appearance, one for a government building and one for mass housing. But brutalism gained a considerable importance and momentum in the UK during mid 20th century because, as I said, it was right after the World War II and people were always looking for inexpensive construction, and design methods for low cost housing was always in need at that particular point of time. So the next 10-15 years saw a wide variety of brutalist architecture that sprouted all around Europe and US. Many architects chose brutalist style even when they had good budgets for the building, because they appreciated the honesty, the sculptural quality of the building, and sometimes even the uncompromising anti-bourgeois nature of the style. They called that the building was simple, it was functional, and it had the honest expression of the materials that the buildings were using. So, in that sense, they appreciated this quality and they kind of used, even if they had the budget for the building. Brutalism was promoted as a very positive option for positive, forward moving, modern urban housing. But in practice, what happened was many of the community serving features went into claustrophobic, crime ridden tenements. The rough coolness of concrete under the damp and grey northern sky became an eyesore. Its fortress like looking material, which once promised great security and which was actually promoting anti-vandalism in its advertisement, in such a bad state at some point of time that it was actually vulnerable to spray can graffiti. So, the movement eventually lost its character because of all these things. What makes brutalist buildings? They are usually formed with striking repetitive angular geometries. Concrete is used predominantly, often revealing the true nature, texture, and sometimes even revealing the texture of wooden forms that were used in situ cast. Although in brutalist architecture most of the buildings are done with concrete, not all brutalist buildings are from concrete, or you can also not say any concrete building is not a brutalist building. So, there are concrete buildings and there are brutalist buildings, and sometimes they might match also. Sometimes critics say that it is this abstract nature of brutalism that makes the style a little unfriendly and uncommunicative, because it cannot become integrating and protective as its proponents intended it to become. Because when you have large number of openings and when you have porous architecture, there is a lot of life in it, and when there is very less openings and lot of concrete in it, the visual weight increases and it looks more like a prison than a residential building, and the amount of life that these kind of buildings propagate becomes lesser and lesser. So, that is when this kind of architecture becomes unfriendly. Brutalism is not concerned with the material as such, but rather the quality of the material. That is, with the question, what can it do? And by an analogy, is there a way of handling gold in brutalist manner, and does it not mean rough and cheap? It means what is its raw quality? That is brutalism for you, ladies and gentlemen. With this, we come to the end of this lecture. We will quickly summarize what we learnt in this lecture. We tried to understand the evolution of architectural scenario from modernism to Siam to Team 10. We understood the reasons behind people looking out for the new truths in different styles. We understood brutalism, neo-structuralism, the two main factions of Team 10. With this, we should be able to answer the following questions. What is Team 10? Why did they call themselves Team 10? Explain the philosophy of Team 10. Why did they separate? Explain the idea of brutalism in architecture with sketches. With this, we come to an end of this first lecture. In the next lecture, we will continue brutalism, and we will also look at more concepts that got developed after Team 10. Until then, thank you.